Okay, so like I said, we went to image adjustments, shadows and highlights, right? So in shadows and highlights, we basically have two sliders. So the first slider, what it's sort of saying is let's boost the shadow amounts. And you see that, how it evens out the tone, right? It's kind of an ingenious tool. So it's sort of looking at the darker, blacker pixels in the image and kind of boosting their value. And you can sort of do the same thing with the highlights, but in this case, you're kind of dropping them down. Now this looks ugly, very different from the original, and I don't want to push that too far. So as a base color adjustment, usually I'll try something like this, especially when there's some harsh shading and highlights. Now there is a show more options button, which I usually will turn on. Before I do though, I just want to draw your attention to one other aspect of Photoshop. If you hold Alt while you have a pop-up window like this in Photoshop, so you see in a pop-up window there usually be an OK button and a cancel button. When you hold Alt, the cancel button becomes a reset. So it'll reset the tool to its kind of like default setting. Some of you may know that, may not, but. So I'm going to go to show more. Actually, I'm going to reset first and then go to show more. So what this does is it sort of expands the tool out. So you've got a couple new sliders for shadows and a couple new ones for highlights. And then you've got an overall adjustment sort of slider. I usually don't touch these a whole lot at all. But so what this is doing right here, the shadow amount, we're basically saying what percentage of the dark gray, black pixels, what percentage are we going to affect, okay? The tone slider is basically, are we going to darken that tone or affect a small section of it or a much higher degree of that area? So right now I just want to kind of see that I can get into the small crevices and affect just those areas. So I'm going to maybe drop the tone slider down a bit. Okay. Now for highlights, we're saying, you know, what percentage of highlights do we want to affect? And in this case, it's pulling them to 50% kind of brightness, let's say. So it's pulling them into a gray area. Whereas if we sort of move this to the left end, we're kind of maintaining the brightness and again, kind of evening out the tone a bit. Again, we want to be careful not to lose any information, not to make anything super flat white and big patchy areas. And if you want to compare before and after, which I usually like to do, right? We tend to, it looks like we're getting more detail now in the lighter areas, and we've softened the shadows in the darker areas, right? So you guys hopefully can see that before and after. It's a really great tool. So one of the kind of things that messes with people's minds is that we have to take textures captured from a real world source. They have lighting and shading built into them. We almost have to strip out that lighting and get an even color version of these surfaces so that we can in fact relight them inside our 3D applications, right? So this sort of color correcting phase is usually one of the first things I do, and I think probably one of the most important parts of preparing your textures. Okay, so there's my new after, okay? Now, I may still want to try to work out the shadows in these crevices, okay? So what I can do is use the magic wand tool. Now, I heard you guys did a lot of Photoshop last semester, right? Or some. So the magic wand is this little tool over here. And W is the shortcut. So I'm going to just click on this. And I'll draw your attention to this little area right at the sort of top area. There's settings for the magic wand tool. So there's something called a tolerance. So the higher the number, basically the more it's going to grab a continuous area that's similar in color, but not necessarily exactly the same. So for me, like when I'm doing stuff like this, I could leave it as low as 8 or go as high as like 30 as a general rule. I know from this morning, 15, 16 works okay for me. So I'm going to just go in and magic wand, click on this little area. And I may want to expand that. So I'm going to hit Control W to zoom in. Hold the space bar so I can left click and drag while holding the space bar to move over to this area. And if I want to add to the selection, I just simply hold Shift and click on extra areas that I want to grab, right? So I'm kind of grabbing all the colors in this area, right? Now, I'm going to hit Control 0, so that allows me to see the full image, full screen. So Control 0 kind of zooms back out. I love my shortcuts, by the way, especially like these are very, very commonly used things you do in Photoshop, and it's much quicker to kind of pick up the shortcuts and to go through the menus and stuff. So if I want to select pixels of a similar darkness or color palette, I can simply go to Select and then go to Similar. So it's literally going to analyze the whole image and find all the pixels that are of the same or very, very similar colors. So watch what happens when I hit Similar, right? It's hitting all the shadow regions. Why would I do that by hand when I can just, right? Let Photoshop do the work. Okay, so that's pretty awesome. Next step. This might be hard to see because I know the icons are kind of small and we're doing this on the projector, but at the bottom of Photoshop, you can make new layers, which is looks like a little white page with a corner bent. There's a little folder icon, which allows you to organize layers and tuck them into folders, which I'll probably do a bit later on. And then there's this thing called adjustment layer. So if you want to maybe change color, brightness, contrast, that kind of stuff, you could do it as a separate layer that doesn't destroy the original image that's in the file. And you can always go back and change the color or the hue via the adjustment. We'll definitely come back to this in a second. Then there's layer mask. So if I have a selection like this active and I click on layer mask, what's selected will become invisible, or vice versa. What's not selected will become invisible. It's taking a second for some reason, but so that's what happens when you have a selection and you turn on layer mask. Yeah, this is being really slow today. So I'm going to undo this. Because what I want to do is actually apply an adjustment layer. So the adjustment layer is that kind of half dark, half light circle. And I'm going to pick probably just a straight brightness contrast, or maybe I often actually use Hue Saturation, and I'll sort of show you why in a second. So Hue Saturation, all right, it's going to load this little panel here. Let me just dock this over here. So what's happening is, if you can see this, so I'm going to change my panel options. I'll just make the icons larger so you guys can see that a little more easily. Yeah, let's do this. Okay. So what happened was my selection became what's known as a layer mask, right? So as soon as I added an adjustment layer, it puts this mask in. So the white areas is what's going to allow my changes to go through to the bottom layer, right? So now I've got this Hue Saturation slider, so I can actually make this bright red, which looks kind of weird. But what I'm probably going to do is just simply lighten those crevice regions, right? And I may just sort of shift them into the yellow area, since this overall kind of texture is a bit more on the yellow spectrum, right? And I can play with saturation as well. I don't want them super saturated, but what I'm trying to do is just kind of even out the tone, right? De-shade, essentially. So here's my before and my after. Now for you guys, you may not see much of a difference, but one other thing to be careful of too is that, you know, sometimes these masks can be kind of, you see it's kind of pixelated and noisy. So what you can kind of do to just tweak that, I'm just clicking on the mask, by the way. I just want to show you one difference too. So I can click on a mask and paint in it if I want. But if you really want to see the mask and what's happening with it, you have to Alt left click on the mask to actually preview it in Photoshop. Okay? Yeah.
What was the option in the layer mask that you created it?
Well, I had the selection active and I simply just created an adjustment layer. Okay. So I went to Hue Saturation. Now I could have gone brightness contrast, whichever one of those adjustments I picked. Because I had a selection active, it would have generated that mask for the new adjustment layer. So again, to kind of get rid of some of this pixelation, I could have done something beforehand, but a lot of times I end up forgetting. So I'll just go blur. So filter, blur, and then Gaussian Blur is one of my go-tos, I guess. So I'll go Gaussian Blur. So it's going to pop up this little preview window. Now this is a lot of blurring actually. So what I'm going to do is just change the pixel radius down. I usually do something like 1, 2, 3, something like that. So it's just a little bit of gentle sort of softening, right? And if we take a look, it sort of bleeds into the rest of the texture a little more nicely, okay? So I think that would be like the process for de-lighting your image. There are a few other ways we can go about this. So I could do roughly the same thing. You know, I've done this before where I basically just load the selection again. By the way, I'm turning off the adjustment layer. I'm kind of running through this a bit quickly, but I turned off the adjustment layer, right? Just to turn off the visibility of that to show you another technique. Well, what's great about these layer masks that I have is that if I hold Control and click on them, it'll reload it as a selection again. So I can try to apply this on another layer. So if I go in, let's say, to another layer, I'll just go New Layer. Let's say I go Shift F5, so I'm going to fill this layer just in the selections with a color. I'll go, I'll just say Color, which will bring up the little color palette, and I'll just eyedrop sort of an average kind of brownish yellow that sort of seems to fit everything else, and that'll be my fill color. And I'll hit Control D, which deselects, right? So you see I've kind of just plugged in all the shadow regions now with a flat color. Now it looks a little weird because it just kind of looks like somebody's stuck in like some kind of like filler into those areas, but I can play with the blending mode now to try to get a better, so I'm going to cycle through these a little bit. Color burn, no, a lot of the top ones are kind of dark, so I'll probably go lighten maybe. Let's try lighten. Man, Photoshop being really, really slow today. There we go. So there's screen, lighten, color dodge being really weird, right? Super weird. So I could go maybe like lighten or screen, I guess in this case seems to be okay. Overlay oftentimes can work really, really nicely too. Let me just zoom out a bit. I guess something's going wrong today, but there we go. There's a little before, after, right? So yeah, screen or overlay might actually be good. And if it's a little too intense, I could just dial it down by changing the opacity of that layer as well. So, you know, I could take it down 10, 20, 30%, right? So there's a lot of little steps, but they kind of chain together to give you a much, much better result, right? Now, let me just open my original if I can, or show you what the original looked like. Yeah, history. Go. So I'll just jump back and show you there's our original and then our corrected, right? It's not too bad. So, yeah, let's take a break actually.